So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Range 4 webcast. Today we're talking about DevSecOps. Is it a good thing? I'm Helen Beal. I will be your host today. I describe myself as a DevOpsologist. We don't really like job titles in the DevOps world. We like roles. So I feel that DevOpsologist describes what I do as a DevOps expert, consultant, coach, trainer, writer, games facilitator. Lots of things we do here around DevOps, and today we're going to hone in and look at this DevSecOps angle. So we have an agenda today. We're going to go through a few things. We're going to talk about what DevSecOps actually is, so I'll set the scene, and then we'll talk about why some people are thinking it's a bad thing, and then we'll review that in the light of why it might be a good thing. And we're also going to ask ourselves the question, will DevSecOps last forever? And then I'm going to finish off with some suggestions of things that you can do next around DevSecOps. So first of all, let's explore this thing called DevSecOps. You're all probably pretty familiar with DevOps. DevOps is what we call a portmanteau, or it's a contraction of two words. Other examples of portmanteaus include Brangelina, my favourite, and brunch, which was also suggested to me as well. So DevOps originated by this recognition that developers had started to do things like agile development, and the ops teams were kind of getting a little left behind. So we started with the concept of agile system administration and the recognition that we had created silos in the way that we had traditionally organised enterprise IT into a development team and an ops team, or very large departments of both. And those silos had differing goals. So the goals for dev broadly changed, the goals for ops broadly stability, and there was not very good collaboration between them. So there were lots of handoffs causing lots of delays and lots of things happening, like developers complaining that it was taking operations far too long to provision environments, as an example. Operations people complaining that development staff were asking for administration access to production systems. Releases taking a long time, releases sort of been thrown over this wall of confusion between the two departments, perhaps with some instructions that ops would try to follow, then the code would get deployed, it would go wrong, everyone would have a very stressful hair on fire moment, and there would be a lot of pointed fingers at who made that go wrong and whose fault it was. So those are the kind of things we've been trying to deal with when we've been talking about DevOps, and it has become a much wider subject as time has gone on. In October last year, the DevOps Handbook was published by IT Revolution Press, written by Gene Kim, one of the authors of the Phoenix Project, kind of, if you like, the DevOps hack. If you want to know about DevOps and you haven't read the Phoenix Project, we would recommend that you do. It's a really easy read. It's written like a novel, so there's lots of characters and narrative arcs in it. It's not very dry like these kind of non-fiction books like the DevOps Handbook tend to be a bit drier. I can only read a few pages at a time without kind of drifting off. Phoenix Project are a lot more engaging. Other authors include Jez Humble, who also is one of the co-authors of Continuous Delivery and also co-author on the Lean Enterprise. Patrick Dubois, who is, if you like, the godfather of DevOps. So he was the one that originally stood up the Agile System Administration Google group. He was the one that started the Twitter hashtag around DevOps Days, which created the whole thing that we call the DevOps movement now. And John Willis, who was at the first DevOps Days that Patrick had in Ghent and coined the acronym CAMS, which we often describe as an elevator acronym. So if you were in a lift and you had 30 seconds with the CEO to explain what DevOps is about, you might want to use CAMS to explain that DevOps is a framework and a movement that considers culture, automation, measurement, and sharing as the key component parts of DevOps. Many of you may know it as CALMS. Jez Humble, as I just said, author of Lean Enterprise, put the L for lean in CAMS to make it CALMS as well. So I've put the cover of the DevOps Handbook up on this slide, and it has got a subtitle, which is How to Create World-Class Agility, Reliability, and Security in Technology Organizations. So it does mention security there, but it does come last. And actually the security chapter in the handbook itself is also the last chapter. So it makes us ask this question, is security a bit of an afterthought? And this is something reflected by security experts that we meet when we're doing things like our assessments. So Actually, I quite recently gave a copy of the DevOps Handbook away to one of a group of people that were involved in the conversations that we have with people when we do an assessment. And he was the security expert, because the first thing he did was came in the room and said, and this was before we'd even started this conversation, this was actually in the interview briefing that we do before we start the series of conversations. He said, there is no place for, nobody talks about security when they talk about DevOps, it's just not a consideration. So there is this kind of feeling in the market that even though we might in DevOps talk about making better software faster and more safely, people feel that security may have been left out a little bit. So I wanted to show you another example, or an example of why this might happen. So I mentioned the Phoenix Project just now as this kind of book, like a hack if you want to learn more about DevOps. The Phoenix Project is a novel about the company called Parts Unlimited. We've taken that novel with our partner Gaming Works, who are expert games makers, and they have made it into a business simulation. So this is from the business simulation teacher tool, and this is the description of the people that would be in the room, or the roles that would be played in the room when we play a Phoenix Project game. So the games master, or the games leader, actually plays the CEO position and the CIO position. All the other positions there, retail operations, CFO, and human resources, those are the three business positions. VP IT Ops, App Dev, IT Support, Tech Ops, Lead Engineer, IT Testing, Change Management. They are all played by people in the actual game. So we run these publicly. We've got one that's fully booked coming up later this month, and we run them privately. I ran one yesterday, in fact. But you'll see there is also a CISO role. A CISO role is up there reporting into the CEO. And this is something we observe quite often in organisations. And of course, security isn't all about information security, although you'd think it would with the CISO role, because that is the information security officer. But there are other security considerations that people have. Physical security, for example. So actual fences, walls, doors, locks, alarms. Also physical security in terms of training people not to reveal passwords. Some people are very good at what's termed as social engineering and getting that sort of information to get into a building and into rooms where they shouldn't be. But the point here really is that CISO role is kind of stuck out on the edge, and this is fairly common, as I said. And this partly happens because CISO or security is a very niche subject. So even in very large organisations, we see very small security teams. It's often just a handful of people, just one person. The security industry is reputed to be very underserved, with like 2 million, I've heard, 2 million roles open and unfilled out around the world. So if any of you are looking for a career change, then security might be something you want to consider. The CISO role in the game, as in the book, though, is pretty critical. If you've read the book, I'll give you a summary anyway of what happens. So in the book, basically, there's a guy who is an IT manager. His name is Bill, and he is told that he now needs to become VP IT Ops. And he doesn't really want to. It sounds like too much pressure, and he's got a young family and things, and doesn't really want to be away out of home and working those many hours. But he's basically told if he doesn't take the role, he hasn't got a job. And they have a Phoenix project going on, which is to do with their e-commerce systems at this particular company. And the company's future is on this project. The success or failure of this project will dictate what happens to the organisation. So Bill gets involved. He does all sorts of things. So he understands things like change. Change is a really big part of the book. And there's a scene where they collect lots of post-it notes because the change system they are using, no one is using because it's really just too clunky and obstructive. So they whittle that down, and they end up with rooms full of post-it notes and realise how enormous amounts of work they've got. They've got far too much unplanned work because they've got lots of technical debt. They've got far too much change coming through for their resources and capacity to handle. So they need to do some serious capacity management. They need to tackle that technical debt. All sorts of things need to happen. And then we meet another character called John. And John is their CISO, their security person, and he is obstructive with a capital O. He's a very, very difficult person to get on with. He is very detail driven. He's saying no to just about everything. And is generally being a complete pain to everyone in the organisation. He's a massive constraint. And that's a true story we hear from lots of other organisations. We've got to understand why security people behave like that. And it's partly because they're really under pressure. They've got far, far too much to do. And other people just don't speak their language. Their view on the world is quite different. However, with the world as it is, increasingly digitised with increasing amounts of threats and stories like Equifax, I'm sure you all heard the Equifax story a couple of weeks ago, these data breaches and things are becoming more and more significant. So DevSecOps sets out to help John. And by the way, just a little kind of appendix, if you like, or an epilogue to that little story about John. John actually becomes absolutely critical to the success of the Phoenix project and turns around his role and the role of the success of the organisation. He kind of goes away, has a little mini breakdown, and then he comes back and he's like a renewed man with loads of energy, a different view, very positive, understands the connection suddenly between business and IT, and he and Bill go around and they talk to all of the business leaders about what's important to them and get clarity over how to prioritise the product backlog they have. So John becomes a very significant person. So DevSecOps, and here though you'll see there's a website here, devsecops.org, started by Shannon, very famous security lady, and she started this, and she's done a manifesto. And you may know that in DevOps, the DevOps kind of progenitors have resisted putting a manifesto out there in the way that there is for Agile. They've kind of said, we don't really want to do that. We don't want to pin it down. I often use a slide where I talk about balanced scales, and on one side I'll have a flying bird and on the other side a cage. And what I'm trying to say is that DevOps has kind of been allowed to fly free. So it's become much more actually than just Agile system admin and getting Dev and Ops to work better together. It's become very much more about considering the entire value stream end to end, including business IT and everybody that is involved in that change. So as well as DevSecOps, you might have heard people talk about DevTest, BizSecOps, and just kind of conglomerating all of the roles that are involved in an end-to-end value stream. So you might ask, why has DevSecOps got more power, if you like, in the market than DevTestOps, for example, DevArcOps, or any other examples you might want to choose? So Shannon stood up this manifesto, and she's saying there's simply a better way for security practitioners like us to operate and contribute value with less friction. We must adapt our ways quickly and foster innovation to ensure data security and privacy issues are not left behind because we were too slow to change. So there's a recognition there that security could become a blocker or a constraint to people trying to do things in a DevOps way. So with DevOps, we're really trying to increase two things: throughput and stability, with neither compromising the other. So if you were to scroll down a little bit more on this page, you would come across the manifesto here. So I'll just go through this in a couple of moments. So these are the things that Shannon thinks security staff should do. So the first one is leaning in over always saying no. So as I just described, John, known as this person that just says no. We have customers where we've talked to the security team and they have said, well, no one listens to us. So now we just give them a document that makes them legally sign off on the risk that they're taking, and then it's just done. So they have this reputation, whereas what we're really saying is actually we need security people to be more involved. The challenge to them often is that they are massively resource constrained. So I described earlier, we have a problem with a resource constraint in this market. The next one is promoting data and security science over fear, uncertainty and doubt. So instead of just like scaring people with Equifax stories, let's kind of do things like look at the Sonatype, for example, State of the Software Supply Chain report. Let's go to InfoSec. Let's learn more about what's actually happening out there and what the real risks are. The third one, open contribution and collaboration over security-only requirements. So this is very DevOps, about being visible and empowering people and contributing and collaborating with people to the overall goal. So we'll come to this later, but this is about security, creating security recommendations and then sharing them and allowing other people to also tweak them, get involved in them, feedback on them. The fourth one, consumable security services with APIs over mandated security controls and paperwork. So this is self-service. This is about helping people to have a shared platform. This is things like making sure there are tools that sit around your artifact repository that can tell people that if they are downloading a piece of code, a binary, an artifact, a component that they want to put into their application, that particular component may have vulnerabilities or problems around commercial licensing that they need to be aware of before they use it. It's about shared service. It's about unlocking that constraint. We want business-driven security scores over rubber stamp security. So some understanding of whether that security thing is a problem for an organisation or not. There may be some regulations that mean, so things like GDPR, for example, that may mean certain security issues are more important than other things. It says red and blue team exploit testing over relying on scans and theoretical vulnerabilities. So this is getting the teams to collaborate to try and hack systems themselves. This is anti-fragility. This is very like the Chaos Monkey, which is similar from a performance point of view and a recovery point of view. So this is proactively trying to break your systems rather than just waiting for electronic scans or maybe that 6-monthly penetration test, all of these things that create handoffs and they create delays and wait time. They're often too late. They're often not automated. It's often very difficult if you just run a scan runs, then you're given a massive document that tells you what the scan found, very little advice on how to resolve it. It's very much a kind of case of closing the door after the stable door after the horse has bolted. What we want to do is catch those vulnerabilities as early on as possible in the system. The next one, 24/7 proactive security monitoring, overreacting after being informed of an incident. So we want to build these systems so that we know what's coming in. We know what people are doing. There are many companies that can help us with this out there. Shared threat intelligence over keeping info to ourselves. So sharing within your company, but also sharing to the global databases when you find a vulnerability. And compliance operations over clipboards and checklists. So trying to get this stuff early. So I wanted to share another bit from that particular website, the DevSecOps.org site, which is from a blog post. And it says the purpose and intent of DevSecOps is to build on the mindset that everyone is responsible for security with the goal of safely distributing security decisions at speed and to scale. So this is very similar to when we say DevOps is not one person's job, it's everyone's job. I just did a presentation this morning just at Jack's London, and I was like, testing is not one person's job, it's everyone's job. DevOps is not one person's job, it's everyone's job. Security is not one person's job, it's everyone's job. We need to break this bottleneck. We need to break this constraint. We need to make our developers and our operations staff, as many people in the organisation, aware of how security works, what threats look like, and spread that knowledge. Rather than keeping it kind of locked up in these one or two people. And that enables us to make more decisions quicker and faster. So this idea of distributing security decisions, again, harks back to that example I just gave you of being able to have a way of monitoring what's in your artifact repository and alerting someone like a developer in an integrated development environment or an IDE to the fact that they might be about to include, for example, a version of struts that has a significant vulnerability in it, and make the suggestion at the time that they don't use that one, that they use this newer version of struts, which the security team have reviewed and have pre-blessed as something that they are happy to go into their applications. And having these tools that run all the time, because the thing about software is it's not like wine, it's like milk. Wine gets better when it ages, or often does. Milk does not. Milk sours when it gets older. And software's like that. More and more vulnerabilities get found over time with software, and things become more threat intensive. And the market itself, the world, is becoming more threat intensive as well. So we need to distribute these skills and spread them out. So then this all sounds like fairly sensible stuff, doesn't it? We're breaking constraints with DevSecOps. We're providing shared services. We're making security data more available. We're automating security at an application level. We're not just using WAFs and web application firewalls. We're not just using physical security things. We are actually understanding that the application may have open doors in it that we need to close. And we can help developers close it at the IDE when they're composing an application. If you don't want to particularly, if you think your developers might get annoyed with that kind of interruption while they're developing their beautiful applications, you might want to break a build at CI or CD, or continuous integration or continuous delivery. You can do that as well. So this all sounds really good. So I've got to ask, why is DevSecOps a bad thing? And the reason I wanted to run this webcast and share this thinking with you is because I was in Belfast at AppSec EU earlier on in the year, speaking on the DevSecOps track along with other people. And one of my fellow speakers kind of was rolling his eyes a little bit at this concept of DevOps. And it was the first time I thought, why do people have an issue with this? I kind of didn't understand immediately why people had a problem with it. Um, and really, it's kind of a bit like why we don't like DevOps job titles, why we don't like DevOps teams, because part of it is that potentially by creating a thing that is DevSecOps, we could be creating another silo, another way of people saying, that's not my job, it's DevSecOps' job. Whereas I need to refer you back to what we just saw on Shannon's blog, that DevOps is for everyone, DevSecOps is for everyone. What DevSecOps is really trying to do is drive that thinking further through an organisation. So I just wanted to share with you this this blog post here from Tom McLaughlin at ThreatStack. He said, while the term DevSecOps has started to come up more often recently, and this was about 18 months ago, we're still wrapping our heads around DevOps to answer questions such as, how do I implement DevOps? Where do I find DevOps engineers? And what does DevOps even mean? Because I just asked 6 people and got 8 different answers. And now this new term, DevSecOps, comes along. So this is partly another reason why people are uncomfortable with this term DevSecOps. It's like, not only are we potentially creating another silo and another excuse for people to say that's not my job, do we even need it? It's hard enough understanding what we mean by DevOps. And as I described earlier, DevOps doesn't have a manifesto. It doesn't have piles of documentation. We have things like the DevOps Handbook, which is not prescriptive, it is guidance. And a lot of people have trouble understanding what DevOps is. We have customers who have stood up DevOps teams because they're a development team, agile team with some developers in it, and they've put a couple of support people in, and their interpretation of that is that they're doing DevOps. We have other customers who have built a little bit of CI and then a little bit of CD, so have gone a bit further into continuous delivery, and they've done that in a team and they think they've done DevOps. But DevOps is much bigger than that. As I said, it's not one person's job, it's everyone's job. It requires fundamental cultural attributes about the way that we don't blame each other, but we treat failure as a learning opportunity, the way that we encourage people to be courageous and innovative and to experiment, the way that we build systems to help us support those people while they do those exercises, by meaning that we cannot have catastrophic system failure should something occur. So we have things like very good test environments, production-like test environments. We do things like blue-green testing. We have feature toggles and canary testing. We have the ability to use automated deployment to redeploy last name good state instantly should we get a problem. We have things like application performance monitoring tools that allow us to preempt failure and understand if some kind of thing is going to come down. And we do things like we build quality and performance and security in at the start. So we do automated testing every time we commit our code doing continuous integration. So we test very early and very frequently. We do things like when we deploy any kind of environment, we want application performance monitoring on it, not just in production, but in all our pre-production environments as well, so we can preempt problems later. And we do things like help our developers understand what security issues may exist in their applications. So why is DevSecOps a good thing? Well, just to kind of summarize what we've just learned, DevSecOps is here to help us break the constraint that we have in security, and it's doing it culturally and systemically from an information technology point of view. So from a cultural perspective, DevSecOps is saying, don't just leave security to your security experts. Everyone in the organization must take a responsibility for security, and our security experts will make it as easy as possible to find the information, to learn what's important, to know how to look for security vulnerabilities as possible. And from a systemic point of view, we will do things like give you pre-blessed libraries of information and vulnerabilities that you can refer to and use in your daily work. So DevSecOps is a good thing because it helps us break the security constraint, and it helps us build security into everything that we do and give everyone accountability for it. could be a bad thing because we've already had quite a lot of trouble in some areas understanding what DevOps is and what it means to us and why we want it. And it could be bad because we just created another thing. Do we really need another thing, another silo, another excuse for people to say, that's not my job, that's DevSecOps' job? So let me ask you another question, but just before we do that, let's have a look at this. So this is from the DevOps Handbook. So I showed you the cover earlier on. This is a description of from the DevOps Handbook. We use it a lot in our DevOps Foundation course, actually, and it looks like a lot of words, but we're just going to break it down into two sections. The first section, before the ... says one way to enable market-oriented outcomes. One way to enable market-oriented outcomes is for operations to create a set of centralized platforms and tooling services that any dev team can use to become more productive. So you may have heard the term no-ops previously. So Adrian Cockcroft, I think when he was at Netflix, said, there's this thing called no-ops. When developers do DevOps, they don't need ops anymore. They can go and deploy straight into the cloud and just don't need any of those operations resources. Kind of do, because there are things that we need to do around things like support, and things like security. So actually, rather than let devs just go off and build their own CD platforms, and that can be very complicated in large organizations where you've got lots of development teams and suddenly you end up with multiple fragmented CD platforms and duplications of one team using Puppet, another using Chef, another using Ansible. So you've got duplication potentially of software investment, but also in skills investment, which makes it hard for us to be you could be cross-functional in a team, but if you want one person to move to a different team and they know Chef and that team uses Puppet, that does reduce the amount of flexibility that you can experience. So why not let ops work with the dev teams and stand up a centralized platform of a DevOps pipeline that can be used by all the dev teams? And then the next statement is basically a list of things that you might want to include in that DevOps pipeline. So we've got shared version control repository. Most people have that, but I've met a couple of quite significantly large organisations recently that don't have that. But then these ones that are in green, the pre-blessed security libraries, the code quality and security scanning tools. So the DevOps Handbook suggests that these should be part of the DevOps pipeline that the ops team will stand up as a shared service for the rest of the dev teams. When we use this statement, and we use it in the DevOps Foundation course, we use it a lot in assessments. If we go through with a team, and I usually get a flip chart and bullet each point out, so version control repository, pre-blessed security libraries, deployment pipeline, code quality, security scanning tools, deploys application to known good environments, already have production monitoring tools. Quite a lot of people don't have most people, as I say, have the version control repository. Some people have a bit of code quality. Most people need quite a lot of help with that. The two that people hardly ever have are the pre-blessed security libraries and the security scanning tools. So, a big area for people to be working on there. Big opportunity to tighten up our houses. So, this last question really is: will DevSecOps last forever? I was at Jack's London, I mentioned earlier this morning, doing a presentation on DevOps-driven development and delivery, and I bumped into a fellow InfoQ author, Daniel Bryant, on my way out, and I said that I was doing this webcast this afternoon, and I asked his opinion on it. And is DevSecOps a good or a bad thing? And he kind of said the same thing. Oh, we're not sure that we need another thing. Why do we need another thing over and above DevOps? And I said to him, and I'd said this to someone last week as well, and they did kind of cringe when they said it, but I said, I feel like it's a bit like feminism. And they kind of went, what do you mean? And it's like, well, feminism isn't about women being better than men. Feminism is about equaling the balance. And until that balance is equal, we kind of need this thing called feminism. So kind of taking you back to the start of the presentation when I asked, is security a bit of an afterthought in the DevOps world? I think it honestly has been. We've used a few examples, like why organisational structures have been the way they are, why security behave the way that they do. Looked at the DevOps Handbook, mentioned that it's the last chapter in there where we look at security, and it has, I think, to be fair to the security community, security has been a bit of an afterthought for the DevOps world. So DevSecOps is here to try and remedy that and bring our attention to the fact that we should be talking security more. But I don't think it will be here forever. I think we've already seen things like rugged DevOps was a kind of a thing a year or 2 years ago. That's kind of all already fallen to the wayside. Nobody really talks about rugged DevOps anymore. You may have seen it mentioned on Shannon's DevSecOps.org web pages, but DevSecOps is the one where we're seeing tracks at places like AppSec EU. So it's around for now to try and remedy the fact that we left it behind a little bit. So let's finish off with a few things that you can do next. So I've mentioned this capability that you can have to, sorry, I'm just going to go back to that slide, this capability of scanning your artifact repository. So we can offer you a free scan of your artifact repository if you like. We'll send you a link in the follow-up email, or if you're watching this as a recorded webcast, you can get hold of us via the Range4 website or at hello@range4.com and ask for your free scan. So we can tell you what the bill of materials of your application looks like, which component parts you have in there are open source and which ones contain which vulnerabilities and how dangerous those vulnerabilities are. And then we can help you remedy those vulnerabilities. So ask us if you would like a free scan and report on your open source components. Another thing you can do is you can book on a DevSecOps engineering course. So we've just launched this with the DevOps Institute. We have a public schedule coming up on the 21st and 22nd of February next year. It sounds like a while away, but you'd be surprised how fast that comes around. We have stood up a whole 2-day course around this. We have 2-day courses on DevOps Test Engineering, CD Architect, as well as a number of other things like DevOps Leader. Security is quite a complex subject, and it easily bears a couple of days drilling down into the security element of it and understanding as DevOps people what good security looks like, the kind of challenges we're facing, and the kind of methodologies that we use in DevOps to shift left and to build security in and to share things like pre-approved security libraries. So there's lots in there. It does require you to have already passed the DevOps Foundation course certification. That is a prerequisite for the DevSecOps engineering course. Our next public schedule of that is in December on the 13th and 14th. Both of those courses, by the way, are in London. Both of these courses you can also run privately as well, by the way, so you don't have to come to our public schedule. You can get in touch and order one just for you and your team, minimum of 5 people. And then the last thing I wanted to mention to you, and again, those on the webcast today, you'll get a link in the follow-up email. Those of you that are not on the webcast today are on a recorded version. This all-day DevOps event is happening on October the 24th, 2017. You can do a search for it. We'll send you a link to the follow-up email if you're on the course. I'll be there. I think my slot is at 10:30 in the morning, and I'll be talking about DevSecOps and the DevOps super pattern. So that was the material that I wanted to cover with you today. I now have a few minutes for questions. So if you have any, now's the time to pop them into the question box, or the chat box is fine as well. I can't see any. Oh, no, I can see one there as well. So I've got a question here, which is, what are the most popular DevSecOps tools? So I think it's important, before I kind of dive into tools recommendations, is to actually talk about the kind of challenges that people are facing and what's happening in the software development world. So we all know that the internet arrived a while ago, and it's created a sea change in the way that businesses work. So lots of organisations now, Hiscox, Target, that were traditionally insurance or retail, and those 2 examples that I've given you, will quite commonly, openly stand up and describe themselves now as technology-driven companies. They have moved away from IT being an order taker that delivers some back office systems like MRP, and they are now strategic innovators, and they differentiate themselves against their competition and any new disruptors by being very, very good at IT. So if you read the State of DevOps reports, you'll see that statistically correlations have been proven between high-performing organisations and high-performing IT organisations. So high-performing IT organisations is innovating lots of stuff. So there is lots of change, and that will be in their software. So Mark Andreessen famously said, software is eating the world. So lots of software is being delivered. In the olden days, a developer would tend to develop code. So they would write lots and lots of code, and that would be the application. in the new days, in this new world where we have companies like JP Morgan having more software developers than Google, for example, those developers are tending not to code from scratch. They are tending to download components. So some estimates say that in modern applications, upwards of 90% of an application is composed of open source components, which are kind of found on the internet. So we did a scan recently with one of our customers, and one of the components in the code was a Betfair tagged piece of code. So a developer had probably gone there from Betfair, thought, oh, I need to just split code that does this, so I'll just download that artifact. Got stuck in the artifact repository. Most people use artifact repositories, either Nexus or Artifactory from JFrog. Got stuck in there and is in the application, and now providing a nice little gateway. If anyone wanted to have a go at that site, they could try that vulnerability. So there is this challenge that organisations have, that they have software, and you might say, well, why on earth are these developers just like using these bits of incredibly dangerous code? Well, the CEO would probably support this, because the choice is spend 15 minutes coding something from scratch or 5 seconds downloading it off the internet. So the productivity gains by composing applications rather than coding applications are enormous. But as I've just described, it does bring in these problems about these vulnerabilities. Not that we can't write vulnerabilities into our own code, but they're not as commonly known. So these organisations need a way of identifying those parts. So there are lots of scanning tools out there. Some of them, like White Source, very widely used, Black Duck, will scan the code after the application's been built and produce a report that allows you to understand what is in that application and where the vulnerabilities are, much like I've described already. The problem with that is that you have to then read the report. A human has to read the report, spend some time figuring out vulnerabilities, spend some time fixing vulnerabilities. Other tools, and our particular favourite tool, is Sonatype's Nexus Lifecycle tool that works with Artifactory or Nexus and a load of other repositories with a load of different code bases, including Python and PHP and everything that you would expect. They can check it real time and send alerts real time. So rather than having this human having to spend hours after the event checking through reams and reams of data and making changes, we can do these things like we've described. So have the applications built up front. We can provide advice into the IDE about the right components to use. We can provide links to just download the right components. So it literally takes seconds to make those remediations rather than hours, days, weeks to make remediations later. So I can't see any more questions coming through today. So I'll take this opportunity to thank you very much for your time today. We'll be in touch shortly with a follow-up email. And I hope you all have a very DevOps-tastic rest of your week. Thanks very much for your time.